I'm very happy that Saint Seraphim is over there. It gave me a bit of hope that maybe I can get through this after all. There are two parts in me every time I meet people. On the one hand, I absolutely love it and I absolutely love you, and I feel I have the need to just say that every time, and I look forward to meeting people, and that's why I always say yes whenever someone invites me to go somewhere, assuming that our bishops have blessed on both sides. I always say yes because I look forward to just meeting the people there. There's something so beautiful in meeting people, and I think it kind of grew for me from my love of icons in a strange way. Instead of going from people to icons, I think it went the other direction, from icons to meeting people. So I love, as Father said, I love sitting down and speaking to you and answering questions, but the thought of just standing in front of you for 30, 40 minutes, droning on and on about some sort of a topic, scares the life out of me. And I'm very happy when the Father gives an introduction, because I think, okay, 2 minutes have gone. And then I think, it's like when you pass an oral exam during college and you think, okay, just a bit more, just buy a bit more time. I want you to ask questions if you have them, and I want you to look at this nightmare of mine, me being in front of you trying to say something, as a sort of an exam that I hopefully will be passing, in the sense that by the end of whatever God will give me to share with you, I hope you will trust me enough as to ask things that are actually important to you. If that happens, if there's a real need in your heart, and you manage to build up the trust to ask that question, then I'm certain, because it always happens, Christ will give me an answer, and I will grow out of that, and you will grow out of that as well. Father, when I came, told me that I should talk about prayer and all sorts of other virtues connected to busy people. And I went into the woods. It's so beautiful, you have woods around you, that's such a blessing. Of course, the temptation is to go in and not come back, but I did come back. And the first thought that came to me as I was traveling to the woods and back was this idea that somehow monks and nuns are different than from all of you, and that is entirely incorrect. And I think it's because we end up having this romanticized vision about what life in a monastery really is like. Probably it's because most of you have traveled to visit monasteries, and maybe you've spent, an hour or 2 hours or 1 night or 2 nights in a monastery. So you get to see what we show you. But that's not the reality of life in a monastery. The same way when you go and visit somebody's home and you have dinner with them, everybody is, on their best behavior, but that's not really the reality of the family. Visiting monasteries for 1 or 2 hours or 1 or 2 days and imagining that's the life of a monk or of a nun in a monastery is like, I don't know, looking at somebody's Instagram account and imagining that, oh, that's their life. Of course it's not. Of course it's not. Life is difficult. Life is tough. But then you select the best parts of it and you put them up there for the world to see. Because on the one hand, that's what you want to project of yourself and of your life. And then on the other hand, it helps you hope to continue to believe that it is possible at some point that may actually become your life. Life in a monastery is just as challenging and just as difficult, just as busy really, as living in the world. And I'm in a very good position to give witness to that, because I've lived half of my monastic life in a monastery, half of my monastic life in a university or another. So I kind of have a good grasp of what life looks like. We used to wake up at 5:30 That's when our services began in Moldavia, 5:30, which means you have to wake up at least 5 minutes before. That's what I did. Forget about anything. It doesn't matter how you smell. It doesn't matter if you've brushed your teeth. Just drag yourself out of that bed and go to service. And then the service ends around 9. There is a bit of breakfast, which is basically bread and jam and tea or coffee or whatever you need to keep you going. And then you start your working day. And your working day goes until dinner time. Depending on your obedience, it can go way into the night. I used to be the secretary of my monastery. I was also the guide, because I speak a few languages, so it was useful for me to present the monastery to our guests. And I was also the one entertaining guests as we served them, lunch, dinner, and all of that. So I remember we used to get these groups of tourists, groups of pilgrims, and they had no concept of a schedule of any kind. I could go into my cell way past 10 or 11 p.m. and then you still have your prayers to say, and you still have, if you need it, and I definitely needed it, you still have your readings to do. You have to keep on reading in order to keep on feeding your mind, your brains. So you would go to bed, 1, 2 a.m., and then in the morning you wake up at 5:25 again. And you do that every day because it's the same schedule every single day. The Saturdays and Sundays are not the easy days, they are the nightmare days when hundreds of people manage to come. And if it's summer, you can get thousands of people because everybody goes to Moldavia, everybody goes to Bukovina to visit the monasteries. And you don't even have the luxury of screaming at somebody or strangling somebody because you have to be the monk, you have to be serene, you have to squeeze something good out of you, because those people have traveled for so long to be there and they put so much trust in you. It would be such a failure to disappoint them, to fail them. So there is an immense pressure behind any sort of mask of serenity and calmness that you see. What does happen eventually is that as you fight to have that serene face and that calmness that you never really have but you strive for, I think it's almost like a way of God showing His love for you. At one point, I don't really know why or how and when it happens, but at one point the masks that you force yourself to wear become a reality. And actually now that I'm saying this to you, I remember in Father Sophroni Saharov's writings, there's a conversation between him and someone, and that particular person asks him, how can I act with love? I have no love. I want to have love. I want to interact the proper way with my neighbor, with my friend, but I don't have the love I'm supposed to have. And Father Sophroni says, just force yourself to do the deeds of love. Even if you don't have the spring of love in you, to make those deeds, those actions natural, genuine, just do them. Just do them. And then God in time will repay you for your struggle with giving you the thing you're missing. And that, again, I can testify that does happen. So I suppose what I wanted to say at the beginning as a sort of a footnote is I don't believe there is such thing as a busy category of the world and a relaxed category of the world. It's like two people getting to the same place for a meeting and one of them is late because there's traffic. Well, there was traffic for the other one as well, only that the other one kind of thought about it and left earlier. You should have done the same. Which brings me to the next idea. We are all busy, but there are things that we can do about this busyness. There are things we can try at least to do, so we have a more, not relaxed schedule, but at least get through life in a way that doesn't crush you. And Lent really is ideal to develop such ways, because I've always, ever since I entered the monastery, I had this idea. I can't remember, someone must have given it to me or I must have read it somewhere. Lent is almost like a magical period of the year that you can put aside to try everything you wish you had tried ever in your life. It's like an experiment, the time to experiment with yourself. It's the time to try out the sort of, vigil that you would like to do, but you never kind of have the courage to do it. It's the time to try to pray in all sorts of ways that you've read about in the lives of the saints, and as you are reading about them, you thought, oh, actually this rings a bell. There's something in me that reacts to this. You know, how you read something and something in your heart says, oh, this actually belongs to me. I could do this. I can see perfectly well how doing this would help me. Well, Lent has this wonderful advantage of being just a box of time, so to say. It's not our entire life. It's easier to trick one's mind into trying something if it's just for a while, rather than start doing something with the perspective of, oh, I have to keep on doing this until the day I die now. That's a bit scary. But Lent allows you to try things out, and as you try them out, you may discover that one or the other work better for you. I'm trying to think of an example. Prayer, let's talk about prayer, because that's the first thing Father said. There are so many ways in which we pray, or at least we can pray. Apart from the obvious distinction between praying in church during the Divine Liturgy and praying alone at home. You can pray by reading a given set of prayers. You can pray using the Jesus prayer. You can pray making up your own prayer book. That's something that I found actually extremely useful in the monastery. As you read through the Fathers and you find bits and pieces that really touch your heart, just have a special notebook with you at all times and put them down. Take the time, 2 or 3 minutes, to put down those few lines that have touched you. And very frequently when you read Holy Fathers like, St. Isaac, the Syrian, for instance, he's one of the best examples. After he talks about whatever he's, talking about, he will always, sooner or later, after each 2-3 chapters, fall into prayer. It's almost inexplicable, but they always do it. So for a while, they're going to give you theology, and you kind of push through it. You understand it or you don't, you find the use of it or you don't. But all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he says, and when you pray, this is what you should pray like. And he's going to dictate a set of prayers. As you go through them, there will be expressions, there will be images, there will be maybe entire paragraphs that touch you. Only copy those ones. As you go through the Psalter, there are bits and pieces in the Psalter that are always life-giving. There's so much hope in some of the Psalms. There's so much love expressed from the psalmist's heart towards God. Take those down. Just write them down in your little notebook. And don't focus on anything that troubles you maybe in the Psalms. As you go even through the Gospel, there are wonderful bits and pieces of prayer in the epistles, for instance. At the beginning mostly and at the end. At the beginning when the apostles pray that God blesses, them to have a word, and at the end when they bless the community they have addressed, take those and adapt them. Okay, you are not St. Paul writing to a church in Thessaloniki, but you are still the father of your family or the mother of your children. You can bless them, you can replace, you can adapt, you can make that prayer into your own by adapting it. And if you did that only through one Lent, at the end of those 40 days, you will have a small, what I call the emergency notebook. When whatever fights you, whatever temptation, passion fights you, will fight you again, and they do come back. They always come back. Even if you think you've completely defeated them, they will always come back. Then at least you have this thing, this beautiful treasure you've created during Lent. You can reach out and go through it, and it will give you life. Rather than try desperately to go through all those books and identify, oh, where was that wonderful thing? experimenting through Lent is something that I've actually found very useful. It is through one of Lent, one of these experiments, that I discovered how useful even the shortest prayer at night is for me personally. I never dared to do it because I thought, if I start doing it, and you have to be honest about it, we do think this way, we just don't like to kind of confess that we do. If you do start praying a certain way, there's always the worry that it will work. And if it works, then why am I not doing it again and again? And of course, then the answer always will be because I'm lazy or because I choose other things over meeting Christ. And somehow it's more comfortable to not even try it because then I don't know, so I kind of use that as an excuse. I've seen that in myself, and I've definitely seen that in the people I've met. People come and they say, I've tried it, Father, I've tried what we were talking about, and it was so, so wonderful. And the first question they have is, I wonder why I didn't do it before. And when you meet them again at the next confession, and you ask them, well, have you done it after? No. 90% of the time the answer is no. And it's very painful to see that. It's very painful to see that even when we are given to taste what grace feels like, we still choose to give in to our comfort and need to, sleep or watch TV or just waste time. Let me see if there was any logic in what I was saying. Honesty is always the best policy when it comes to spiritual life. Even if indeed your life doesn't allow you the time to pray or the time to do everything you would like to do, being honest about it, at least, will be sufficient to take you further. Being honest meaning don't look for excuses, don't try to build up this context for the reasons why you fail to do certain things. The reality is, when you draw the line, that we allow this life, to overcome, to overtake that life, the life with the capital L. And regardless of the reasons, it's still a failure. And it's very useful to at least acknowledge that and live your lives with that awareness. Because what will happen is that awareness will open in you, God willing, a sort of a splinter. It will open a tiny little door. And through that little door, humility might enter. And if you begin with one virtue, in a most amazing way, others will follow. This church is dedicated to St. John of the Ladder, and that's his entire approach to spiritual life. Begin somewhere, begin with something, but be very serious about that particular virtue, because that one virtue will feed the next one, and then the next one. Virtues are not like individual, beads. They are like a prayer rope. Once you start it, if you start it, you will get to all of them eventually. And to begin with honesty, to begin with allowing humility to take over you, is perhaps the best place to begin. Humility is not something you put on, when you meet people. That's not the sort of thing I'm talking about. It's not me bowing lower than the person in front of me. It's not me looking down or, speaking in a whisper rather than speaking out loud. It's the sort of thing that you feel when you are entirely alone and it's just between you and God. And it can be quite a beast if you allow it to be. It can crush you to pieces. And it's always a good idea to get through it alongside your spiritual father, your father confessor, so that there is someone there to actually pick up the pieces and reconstruct you if it gets too serious. But humility in itself has everything you need to start a real spiritual life. You cannot be a loving person without being humble. And you cannot be a prayerful person without being humble. They are so interrelated that really It's interesting how we got to a point in our lives, and it must be because we allowed the world to train the way we think. We got to a point where virtues are almost like individual objects in a room. And we have this idea that we decide what furniture we need or what furniture we choose for our own particular room. Someone will say, I want to be a humble person and I want to be prayerful, but I don't quite care about generosity, love, patience, forgiveness, not judgment, and all of those. It doesn't work like that. If forgiveness, the ability to forgive, is to be a virtue in Christ, if prayer is to be a virtue in Christ, and not something man-made, not something we make with our own devices, all of these virtues have to feed each other. They will create a network. It will be impossible for someone who's really prayerful, it is impossible for him or her not to be a loving and a humble person. And similarly, someone who's a loving or a humble person, it's impossible for them not to be prayerful. But somehow we've tricked our minds to believe that we can pick and choose our virtues, and that's not the case. So just start somewhere, and I think if you start with honesty, just being very honest about where you are, that will lead you where you need to get, because it will feed the next virtues and the next virtues. I think St. John of the Ladder speaks about, virtues being mothers of other virtues, or them being sisters, or the daughters of other virtues. And this is the idea behind that way of referring to a spiritual life. It also helps enormously if you know why you're doing what you're doing. I mean, I don't think I could have gone through my years in Moldavia, or even I don't think I could go through what I'm experiencing now in my monastic life if I hadn't had an understanding of the deeper reasons for my behavior. So, when I had to, visit banks or employ people for the monastery or greet hundreds of people as the guide and sit them at the table and talk to them about whatever, if I hadn't perceived that as obedience, I don't think I could have done it. Or at least even if I had managed to push through it, I don't think that experience would have fed me in any positive sort of way. I do believe it would have crushed me eventually. But if you perceive that, as I was taught to do in confession, as obedience to your monastery, or as a sacrifice, a personal sacrifice for the sake of the monastery, then somehow even the most mundane things become meaningful, and there is spiritual potential, even, behind silly little things like driving to work or having to make coffee for your co-workers, or God knows what you do in your daily life. But you must begin to see what you do through a spiritual lens. I did not go to a bank and I did not, go through all the paperwork necessary to employ the people that the monastery needed for the sake of it. I did it because that was a tool for me. It was a spiritual tool. It was my obedience. And with that tool, I was working my own salvation. And this is something, again, that I understood very early on in my monastic life. And I've tried to pass this on as frequently as I had the opportunity. If you look at the world and you allow the world to tell you what is valuable in each action, it won't last for long. But if you look at the world and you identify the things you do as spiritual tools in your life, you actually have a good chance to end up a good Christian. And by tool, I don't just mean your work. I mean every single aspect of your life. Your work or your career is one example, but your family is another example. You can look at your spouse, your husband or your wife, and think, oh, what a wonderful person. He or she is here for purely my enjoyment, my physical enjoyment or whatever. And if you do that, you've missed the point, because that person is one with you in a spiritual way. Or you can look at your spouse, your husband and your wife, and think, oh my God, what a horrible human being. I want to strangle him or her every single time I see them. Yeah, that's true. I mean, again, there's no point in denying that marriage can be extremely difficult at times, just as, monastic life, most of the times. But that is, again, potentially a very useful spiritual tool. You can look at your husband and your wife and recognize in the nightmare or the tension or whatever they put in your life, you recognize the tool that is needful for you to exercise your patience, or for you to be able to love a person despite certain things, to enlarge your heart to the point where you are able to forgive things that maybe you were not capable of forgiving 5 years ago. Every single thing in our lives, our jobs, our careers, our friends, our neighbors, our families, can be just that, things of the world. And you have to kind of manage your life through them, or sometimes against them, despite them. Or you can look at them and see the spiritual tool that God has placed in your hand for you to work with towards your own salvation. There are several examples in the scripture that come to my mind now, but I don't want to really go down that route because it could take some time. But I can give you the example of my spiritual father. I mean, my spiritual father has become my spiritual father not because he made a choice, but because I made the choice. I made the choice to look at that man and say in my heart, I trust this man more than I trust myself. At one particular time, when I needed someone else to get me over an extremely difficult period of my life, I had a choice, and I made the choice. I remember it so clearly, to look at that man and actually think in my heart, I trust this man more than I trust myself, and I'm going to follow what he teaches me. I'm going to follow his advice, even if it goes against my experience or against my instincts. And I know now, looking back, that was the moment when that priest was just one of the hundreds of priests in Bucharest alone, the moment when he became my spiritual father. And without that moment, without that choice, I wouldn't have had this wonderful tool that I've used ever since for my salvation. Look at the world and see what Christ is trying to do to you, to your life, through the people you meet, through the work you do, through everything around you. And then everything becomes out of the world to some degree. And then probably the most significant thing one can do, and the one thing that helps me most and more than everything, is to constantly remind yourselves that you are never alone. To constantly remind yourself that we are all part of one single being, and that humanity is not broken as we think, as we imagine, between billions of individuals, but that we are all together before the eyes of Christ. And I don't mean that just in the sense that we are not alone because we have saints around us and we have our angels around us and that Christ is always present. I mean that in a very human, practical, simple way. While we are here talking, somewhere on the Holy Mountain, somewhere on Athos, there is a hermit praying. Once we finish and we are going to, drive home, somewhere as we, I don't know, write our texts or make our phone calls or do whatever we do, wasting our time, somewhere in Moldavia, there is someone praying. As we sleep at night, it doesn't matter, because already in the monasteries in Moldavia, my monastic brothers are already up. They are 6 hours ahead of us, and they are celebrating. And once they finish, that's okay. You've got Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia. There are divine liturgies, there are monasteries pretty much in every time zone. As we go about our lives being busy, or actually allowing we know who to trick us that we are actually busy, somewhere someone is praying. And somewhere in a monastery there is a divine liturgy taking place every single hour. This awareness that we are all one is not something theoretical. That's something I never quite understood, why people find it difficult to understand why this is one of the most important practical things we need to always remind ourselves of. It's not something theoretical, it's something profoundly useful. It helps me to get through my day. It helps me to just forgive myself in a way. Because if I waste time, because I'm not strong enough not to waste time, that's almost, it's not okay, but I'm not completely fallen, I'm not completely lost, because I know that somewhere somebody is not wasting time. And this is where what Father mentioned, almsgiving, for instance, is very important. When you can help another parish or another monastery, or you visit a place somewhere and you find somebody who's really poor, do help. Do help. Help more than it would be logical or rational for you to help in that moment, because you are not going to have the same opportunity the next day or the next month. And every time I do that, I think of it as an investment, really. I invest in the prayer of those particular people, because I know that when I fail, when I fall, they are going to still be standing. And because I am part of their prayer, through them, I have not fallen entirely. For instance, when I go to the Holy Mountain, I purposely buy their prayer robes. I ask them to make their prayer robes rather than me making them, or asking other people to do it. I want them to make those prayer robes so I can get them from them. I know that that helps them. Then they don't have to go on the boat to sell them. They don't have to go to other monasteries or skits to sell them. They get their time and they get to pray. They don't have to waste the time to make their living. I support them. I give them the time for extra prayer. And I know that whatever they do in that extra time, at least a percentage of it, I will get it. I think of it in those very practical terms. I become part of their life. I become part of their prayer. Our booklets, I've now stopped writing the booklets that we published through the monastery, and I've asked them to start writing them. Because I've got enough things happening with the monastery. But if they can write them, and then I sell them, and then I give them some funds to support their skits or their hermitages, once again I become part of their lives. This theoretical idea that we are all one becomes something very palpable. I'm offering them part of their food. They eat the food that I've given them. Their bodies process food that I've offered them. And that makes me, I don't know, I'm very physical and visual in the way I see things. That makes me part of their lives. That makes me part of their prayer. And again, the bottom line is that I know that when I fall, and we all fall, somebody somewhere is standing. And I pray that that person who is standing is someone I've become part of. We are all, this was a topic that I actually spoke on last night in Atlanta, and it's something that's very close to my heart. This need to understand, to force ourselves to hold on to the awareness that we are one. Because if you have that, that again is like one of those magical little doors that opens before you. If you understand that, if I understand that I am partly guilty because you've fallen, then I will pray for you with the desperation that I pray for myself. And then I will be extremely reluctant to judge you, because if I'm co-guilty with you to your own fall, I don't want to judge you, because then I would end up judging myself. And also I will be very ready to forgive you, because I know the same thing. If I'm partly to blame for your fall, when I forgive you, I actually forgive my own contribution to your fall. And the same thing applies the other way around. When I fall, I know that I'm not entirely guilty. I know that the weight that collapsed me, that brought me down, is not entirely my doing. And that, in a strange way, gives me hope. I don't think I will go on with this. I do hope that something in what I said will make you ask a question, because questions are always the best way to continue a conversation. And also, if you want to know more, Father David had asked me a few things about the monastery, and how on earth do I end up on an island in Scotland from Moldavia. If that's anything that's on your mind, please ask me, and hopefully that will open up a bit of a conversation. Thank you. If not, I'm going to bore you about my monastery. See, it works. Yes, Father.
Looking back as a young child or even as a young adult, what attracted you to monasticism versus other professions or other things you could have gotten involved with? And how far back does that go?
As a child, I had no option to consider monasticism or anything that had to do with the church, because I grew up in Romania during communism. So until I was 10, I had really no awareness that there was something called, church or service. Forgive me. I mean, I knew they existed, but the thought that people go to church didn't exist in my mind. And then in the 90s were very difficult in all previous communist countries, by far more difficult than communism itself to some degree. Because everything collapsed economically, everybody was extremely poor. I'm sure you must have seen images of our orphanages and everything that happened in the 90s. So really, things started abruptly with me, very abruptly. I think since I was 14, 15, even earlier actually, I remember when my grandmother died and I was 8, I had this almost attraction towards death in a strange way. Not attraction in the sense that it looked like something pleasant, but I was clearly more drawn to the idea than it would be normal maybe for a child. And that took all sorts of, shapes. I remember I used to keep burying my toys. And then I read I think it was called The Last Among the Mohicans or something, one of those American novels. I remember I was 11 or 12, and I found out that they burned their bodies when people died, and that was fascinating for me. I remember catching bugs and putting them on pieces of wood and putting them in the stove in my grandmother's, and I pretended that I was an Indian, and an American Indian. I've always had this attraction towards the end of things, and when I became a teenager, that came with extremely difficult questions that I couldn't ask anyone. The typical questions most teenagers have, where am I going to, what happens once we die, what happens to the people I love, and so on. But they were extremely intense, to the point that on several occasions they got me very, very close to suicide. Very close. And And these are things that, I never discussed with my parents, or because the culture that allowed you to talk about these things did not exist. This was something you went through, alone, until it crushed you. And on a particular occasion, when I got a bit too close to the kind of end result of such an attempt, I got scared in a very serious way, and I reached out to the one person in my life I really trusted, and this was my best friend at the time. I was 17, not even 18, when we started talking about it, and eventually after such a temptation, he told me, "I don't know what I could do to help you. I think this is beyond me," which is something extremely wise and humble for someone to say, at 17, 18. And he did say, "I think you should speak to a priest," which came as a huge shock for me, because I had no idea that he went to church. We were best friends in the way that, 17, 18-year-olds are best friends. You know everything about each other, and yet he still feared. He was still embarrassed to tell me that he went to church, that he had a spiritual father. And he said, "I think the best thing for you to do is come and speak to this priest who is my spiritual father." And that was the first time I had the thought I mentioned to you before. I must trust him more than I trust myself, because if I don't, if I go down the route I am on, things can end up in a very bad way. And I went and I met this priest, who was the first priest I had ever spoken to in a serious way in my life, and I stayed. And that priest is my spiritual father to the day. So when people ask me, "How do you find a spiritual father?" all I can say, I have no idea, because for me it was the first priest I ever met. But what I can say is that when there is a real need, that's why I keep saying at the beginning of all my talks, if there is a real need in you, ask the question, because God will answer it. When there is a real need for a spiritual father, God will turn anyone into a spiritual father or a spiritual mother, and that person will come into your life. You don't have to look for him or her. They will come. And my best friend, the one who basically saved my life and brought me into the church, is now my monastic brother. We went to the monastery together eventually. So God does have a way to arrange things if you are honest and if you ask for help when you can. And just to finish, because there was that question, the minute I understood, or the minute I found out about monks, I knew that I was supposed to be one. I had known all my life that, I couldn't live in a big city. I couldn't see myself really surrounded by a family, because these questions consumed me so much that I can't imagine having a life that would have required me to go to work on a regular basis and go back home and be a proper husband and a good, father for my potential children. It would have been impossible. But I never knew what monks were. So, in a way, I decided to become a monk the minute I knew they existed. But in my heart, I feel like I've always been one. I just didn't know that there was a name for what I was. I didn't know there was a structure that accommodates what I was experiencing. And then I found out it was called monasticism. I was 18. I told my spiritual father that's what I want to do, and he completely dismissed it for a number of years. And then he said, "Yes, you have my blessing, provided that you wait for 3 years." And it was quite inescapable, because if I'd gone to the monastery before the end of those 3 years, he would not have given me his blessing. And in Moldavia, you must have your spiritual father's blessing to go into a monastery. So I had to wait, which meant I left to the monastery when I was 23. But in my mind, I regret every single hour that I've not been in a monastery. Not that a monastery, again, provides this romanticized space where all your worries are taken away and you float about meditating. It's quite the contrary. It is a very harsh environment, particularly mentally. It's a very harsh environment, and if you've got the slightest mental problem, a challenge, a monastery is not the place for you. And not because, in a monastery you stop falling or you stop sinning or anything. No, I mean, a monastery doesn't change who you are. It just provides the space for you to try everything, as extreme as it may be, to get you out of who you are. It's like an extended Lent, if you want it. It's like Lent forever. But I wish, even the mistakes that I continued to make, even the sins that I've committed before, I wish I had fallen with Christ. I wish I had made those sins with Christ rather than on my own. I perceive everything before the monastery in a way, to some degree, as wasted time for me.
Could you give an example of the kind of honesty you're talking about with regard, let's say, to a prayer life, a thought that would ring true as opposed to an excuse or something that we make? Give me a specific example.
Every time I kneel down to say my prayers, I try my best to be. It's almost like there are two people in you. One is praying, and the other one is supervising the prayer. You're on your right hand side, kind of looking down at you. And sometimes you are going to cry because something really touches you and you are so in awe at what you experience. That's what the person praying feels. But the praising supervising says, you're faking it. That's not really you falling down with tears before God. That's you, thinking about your mother dying. Or it's an emotion that is not really a spiritual experience. Or that's already kind of, advanced sort of stage. Basically, you go through the beginning of your prayers before communion, and you say what I've just told you. I fall down before you in prayer. Well, if I'm on a chair and I read through that and I've got no tears, I've said two things and both are lies. I have not fallen down and I don't have the tears. So what exactly am I doing? Why is that a prayer? And the awareness that we say words but they don't actually have a reality to match inside, that awareness alone in time will generate the reality inside. But if you don't put the effort into stripping down and being, nakedly honest before God in prayer, that will never happen. We are masters at putting on masks and tricking those around us and ourselves in particular. We are so silly. We are so easily cheated by our own conscience. I'm trying to think of, even in our theology, if you ever get to a point where you think, I understand what this particular dogma means, or I know now who God is because I've experienced something. The minute you say, I know who God is, or I know what God is like, I can tell you 100% that in fact you don't really know what God is like. That is just an image, an idol you have created in your mind. And it is extremely important, it's vital really, your spiritual survival depends on it, that you are aware that that is an idol, because otherwise you will mistake the real God for that idol, and you will spend your entire life worshipping that idol that your mind created instead of worshipping God. And what we do really through our entire life is we experience something. We build a vision of who God is and who we are based on that experience. But then what needs to happen so that we can continue to grow is that we need to take a hammer, a mental hammer, and just take down those idols and then start reconstructing again. It's a practical way of applying what St. Denis the Areopagite calls apophatic theology, where you get to learn God by saying who God is not and what God is not like. Basically, God is one, but God is not one. God is free, but God is not free. God exists, but God does not exist. And this is not just gibberish. There are very good theological reasons why he says it. Because when we say God is one, but he's not one, God is indeed just one, but his oneness is not the same as this bottle being one. Because this sort of oneness implies a limitation, implies that there is space defining this one, whereas God's oneness has nothing to do with this. And similarly in our spiritual life, as we experience something, we think, oh, now I get it, now I understand it, and for a while everything is perfect. But that little person who supervises everything should at one point step in and say, okay, enough is enough, now it's time for you to take down this idol and start building again. And what will happen then is that sooner or later you will build another idol. But that new idol will be slightly closer to the real God. And that's what we do all our lives. We fake it and we catch ourselves faking it and we start all over again. And we build these idols based on our experiences, and then we should take them down so that we are open again for another revelation. Honesty is just essential, really, for survival, spiritually speaking. Plus, it keeps pride away, which is enough to justify using it. I mean, nobody who's really honest about one's own spiritual state can ever be proud. It's impossible. I mean, if you're really honest about yourself, I do not know of one person, I have not met one person who is happy about where they are spiritually. Read the prayers of John Chrysostom or Basil the Great before receiving communion. And you'll see, I mean, when Saint Basil the Great says, I'm aware that I eat and I drink my own condemnation. True, what can I say? What can we say? But actually that's how you begin spiritual life, with that honesty. And that honesty will again, if I'm nothing and I'm aware of my nothingness spiritually, how can I judge anyone else? How can I be unforgiving to anyone else when that's the reality of my own life? It all begins with you. Not for each of us. It all begins with ourselves, and we should never lose sight of that. That saint over there, Saint Seraphim of Sarov, I think has the only formula that can be applied for our salvation, which is you do everything that's possible so that you acquire the Holy Spirit. And then thousands around you will be saved. But it is all about you. We should focus on ourselves. And then the spirituality that is built when you're focused on yourself can only be a spirituality built on humility and awareness of our sinfulness. If you build your spiritual life focusing on others, you will end up just judging everyone, seeing what's bad in everyone else, and being honestly just a dreadful human being. Think of all the people you know who always have something to complain about everyone else, but nothing about themselves. And compare them with what you find, in the Holy Fathers or the Holy Mothers, who are always talking about their own sin, who are always repenting for their own sinfulness.
When you're in the middle of your day, the day is going. You start out the day, you intend to have a little spiritual life, you pray, and all of that. When you get in the middle of the fight, just the stuff aside and forget what you just lose it all. How do you get back to that? Or is that just a slow thing you got to do?
I think we are a bit too concerned with repairing things once we break them. In the sense that if you've gone through your life, through your day, and you've been okay until 11 a.m., and then at 11 and 5 minutes, you've had a burst of, anger or something. Once you become aware that that has happened, all you have to do is be aware that it happened. And in your heart, take a minute somewhere, ask for forgiveness. It takes a second to ask for forgiveness, and then don't worry about it. Honestly, just don't worry about it. Regret is not only non-Orthodox or non-Christian, it's absolutely silly, because it's wasting real time, presence. Present is the only time that is real, and you're wasting that real time for the sake of a made up, sort of invented time, invented reality, which is the past. The past is the past. There is nothing you can do about it to change it. Glory be to God. We've got a God who so loved us that He gave His life so we are forgiven. Be very generous in forgiving yourself, but always have the same generosity towards those around you, because otherwise you will just use that as an excuse for your own sins. Just hide somewhere. The minute you become aware, what's going on here? I'm losing the battle here. Find a way, physically hide somewhere, to say just the smallest prayer, which is only, I really am sorry, I will try not to repeat that, help me, and then get out. You may have seen that just before the talk I went into the loo, and I do that everywhere I go. I think people must think that I've got some sort of a prostrate problem or something. I need 1 minute alone, that I don't have to worry about what my face looks like or what emotions are on my face. Or I need to just be alone and be able to cover my face and just allow God to feed me with what I'm supposed to give you. And that's why I hide in the loo, because I know I'm alone there. It's the one place where I know I am alone. But find a place for yourself where you can be as honest as a child in your expressions and the way you manifest. And don't waste any time regretting. The time will come for your confession. You will make your confession as an adult, as a grown man. There's no need to kill ourselves over our sins. I have sinned. I am fully aware that it's my fault. I am fully aware it's a fall. I am fully aware of the implications of that sin, and that I've failed not only myself but everyone else around me. But there's nothing I can do to change that. The one thing that is available to me is present. And in this new present, I will not fall again. And it may help you. It may help you in time get from, falling at 11 a.m., you'll fall at 12 at noon. And then maybe it will be 1. And what will happen by the grace of God, if you really are careful, if you have that little person behind you that always kind of follows you around, we have to develop a way where we kind of supervise ourselves. We are aware of ourselves. If that develops, you will in time see the signs of the break, of the fall approaching. You will sense, wait a minute, just after I've had my cup of coffee yesterday, because it got my blood pressure up or made me anxious, I snapped at my friend or my secretary or whatever. So maybe if I have just half a coffee today, I will be better. Or maybe if after I have my coffee, I avoid interaction for half an hour. I mean, what I'm trying to say is if you are careful, if you keep vigil over yourself, if you guard the entry into your house, as Christ tells us, you might see the thieves approaching. And in time you will be able not only to fall later in the day, but actually say, hey, hold on, what are you doing here? I don't want you inside. And not let them in. But that takes awareness and again honesty and a lot of generosity for yourself. Saint Isaac the Syrian says that for an ascetic to reach perfection, he must begin with a very generous heart towards himself. You cannot impose rules and expectations and this perfect vision upon yourself from the very beginning, because they are going to crush you. Instead, you have to be very generous and allow yourself to easily forgive yourself, because if you forgive yourself, you are a renewed man and you can start anew and you'll be better this time. Again, don't use that as an excuse. And a good way to make sure you don't do that is to apply the same generosity, the same measure of forgiveness to everyone around you. If somebody really annoys you, ask yourself, I really want not to forgive that person, but I've forgiven myself 2 minutes ago, so I have to forgive them. And that will keep you in check, actually. It sounds funny, but actually it works. Are we ready for Vespers?
I think so.